Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this Chatham House corporate members event on the political economy of the European Union after COVID-19. Over the past 6 months, we've seen an unprecedented level of state involvement in the economy as governments put large parts of their economies into something like induced comas due to the lockdowns required to deal with COVID-19. They started paying wage bills for millions of workers, guaranteeing loans to many businesses, and in all, the role of the state in the economy has at least temporarily fundamentally changed and become much larger. This has in turn raised questions for what the economic settlement will be and should be after the pandemic. Will electorates then, for instance, demand a continued stronger role for the state, and in particular, will they demand more protective states? Will we see shifts towards more active industrial policy as governments attempts to increase their resilience to shocks like COVID-19 and attempt to reduce reliance on overseas productions? And will they start to deal with the kind of inequalities, that often already existing inequalities that were highlighted by the pandemic, as we saw those already in the most precarious forms of employment, for instance, bearing the brunt of the economic impact? Looking specifically at Europe, there are questions about what this means for European integration as well. Now that we have the economic data coming in for the first 2 quarters, it's increasingly clear that there's been a large divergence in economic outcomes between European countries, with, unfortunately, the economic outcomes lining up with existing fault lines within the EU. The southern economies struggling more, seeing larger declines in output, and those that were already stronger in the north doing better. We'll discuss these topics tonight with 2 fantastic speakers. First, we have Dr. Julie Smith, who's a reader in European politics at Cambridge University and a member of the House of Lords, and possibly even more important, a former head of the Euro program here at Chatham House, although I guess as a current fellow of that program, I might be a bit biased. We're also joined by Sylvain Poirier, who is the chief EMEA economist at S&P Global Ratings, and who also teaches at Paris Dauphine University. So given how these issues are really at the intersection of politics and economics, I think we have the perfect panel for a really good discussion on this. I therefore also very much look forward to the questions from the audience, as we want to make this as interactive as possible. Please put your questions in the Q&A box for that. That's where we'll be looking. And if you so wish, we will open up the floor as well for you to ask your questions, at least over audio, so we can turn this into a bit more of a discussion. Which just leads me to remind you that tonight's event is on the record, and that a recording of it will be made available on the private YouTube channel for Chatham House's corporate members. And with that, I would like to hand the digital floor to Julie for her introductory remarks.
Thank you very much indeed. This is a first for me. I have spoken many times at Chatham House, and as Pepin said, I used to run the European programme. And in those days, it was always very easy. You walked down a few steps with the speakers and everything was set up. You could see the audience. You knew exactly what you were likely to expect, and you usually recognized a few faces. So there was that sense of, I know where I am and I know my audience. I've never actually done a speaking event via Zoom or Skype or anything else, despite being an academic. I've done various seminars with my students, but it's a little bit different. So if any of this feels strange, if I'm speaking too fast or too slow, I do apologise. I've had a bit of experience doing the House of Lords remotely, and that is a very strange experience indeed, because you get no sense of feedback. And obviously, if you're speaking, you really want to know, what do people think? So again, perhaps put in chat if you think that I've gone off topic or that I'm going on too long. But the challenges of COVID, it is slightly strange to be speaking as a British participant in this panel, talking about COVID and the European Union. When I ran the European programme, there was no question about Britain's membership of the European Union. It's so long ago that it was never in question, and we just assumed that Britain was part of Europe. And so the responses and reactions would have been part of a single whole. Now, of course, we're looking from one side of the channel, an Anglo-Saxon set of responses versus perhaps an EU27 set of responses, or a European Union response. And I think that is one of the things that is worth thinking about, the extent to which the European Union has managed to respond to this crisis as a united European Union versus responding as a series of member states. And I want to talk a little bit about crises and the way various crises have interacted, but also the way the European Union has historically dealt with crises, because I think we're beginning to see something in 2020, which, if you support European integration, if you want ever closer union, is beginning to look a little bit more positive perhaps than the immediate responses to crises in the past. So if I say the European Union, I'm really talking about the institutions versus the responses of the member states. But obviously, as we've already heard, we've got the COVID crisis very much coming in the wake of a whole series of crises, the Eurozone crisis and the refugee crisis in particular. And those two crises very much were mutually reinforcing that the same countries that were being worst affected by the Eurozone crisis then found they were bearing the brunt of the refugee crisis. And the odd thing was that in the United Kingdom, the responses to those two crises, which didn't really affect the UK very much, were used during the Brexit referendum by leavers to say, look at the European Union, look at how badly it treats the people of Southern Europe. There's no solidarity. Look at the youth unemployment. And it was a very powerful narrative that was used both by Lexiteers, those on the left who wanted more solidarity, and as a narrative from them, it was perhaps understandable. But it was also used by right-wing Brexiteers who threw it back to say, oh, look, Europe's not very good at solidarity. You speak a language of a united Europe, but maybe that's not how you're acting and reacting. And I think initially, over the last 10 or 12 years, there was a sense that maybe responses to crises were dealt with nationally rather than by the European Union as a whole. And if you go back to the 1970s, there was something very similar. Just after the UK joined, when we had the Middle East crisis, instead of having a European response, there were lots of different national responses. But what we've seen with the COVID crisis, I think, is a response from European countries individually and the European Union as a whole that has been a little bit more effective and a bit faster than we've seen in previous crises. We obviously have asymmetric effects of the COVID crisis. And initially it looked very much as if the countries that were going to be worst hit were exactly those that had been worst hit by the Eurozone crisis. But if Italy was the first country in Europe really to suffer, we've also seen Italy being a country that has actually managed to respond to the crisis very effectively. And I think one of the success stories is precisely how Italy came back from the first wave and is now actually able to function very effectively. Spain perhaps hasn't managed quite as effectively, but nevertheless, the disasters that perhaps could have arisen haven't arisen or haven't turned out to be as bad as they might have been. But we saw initially asymmetric impacts, and if you looked at the impact in Germany in terms of health outcomes, then it did look really very different. But we also immediately saw two quite different responses from Angela Merkel and Ursula von der Leyen. And I think it's quite noticeable that you've got two German politicians. Von der Leyen had been Merkel's defense minister, come from the same party, and yet their immediate reactions to the COVID crisis were a little bit different. Because von der Leyen, as Commission President, suddenly says, we need a big response. We need a response of all of us, not a response of 27 different states. And Angela Merkel rightly pointed out that, in fact, this was a health issue, and health is not a European competence. And that is hugely important, because one of the key issues for the European Union is, can it respond if it doesn't have competence? Clearly, the member states collectively can get together and say, we wish to respond, we wish to act. There's nothing to stop them doing that. But if the European Commission wants to create an initiative without having a competence to do it, it can be very difficult. And if in addition it's saying, and we need the resources to be able to deliver on our initiative, it can't do that without the political will of the member states. And I think that ambition that was already in March outlined by von der Leyen, and the caution expressed by Angela Merkel saying this isn't a European competence, were both important. But obviously a health crisis has also become an economic crisis in many ways. The huge economic impacts, potential for major cuts to economies, mass unemployment, offset partially by much greater spending and budget deficits in all the member states, then creates a new dynamic, because economics is precisely a European competence, at which point the European Union does have a role. So the interplay between those two issues, I think, is important. And the positive aspect of the COVID crisis has been the way the European Union has been able to respond economically, which is obviously going to be the thrust of Sylvan's discussion, so I won't encroach on that. But the next aspect then, and where I'm going to wrap up after my 7 minutes, is a suggestion that if the European Union really wants to be able to respond to health crises, then we do need some institutional reform. There does need to be some structural reform. Is that possible? Is it likely? It is possible if the political will is there. But at the moment, the driver on the member state side, or the twin drivers, are still France and Germany, led by Merkel and Macron. If they stayed in office for the next decade, I'd be quite sanguine. But if, when Angela Merkel stands down, there is a change in the governance of Germany, everything could change. And if Macron isn't successful, if the way Europe is responding leaves too many people feeling left behind, and the inequalities caused by the COVID crisis, both across the European Union and within France, led to a backlash, then we could see a very different sort of Europe. And that is magnified right across the European Union, that we could, in a positive scenario, see the responses to this crisis leading to a more integrated Europe. The alternative is the rise of populism and European disintegration and frustration. And I will draw to a close there.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting. We'll move it on then to Sylvain, who will discuss the economic side a bit more after just having heard the political side of the debate.
Thank you very much. Eugene, not sure I will focus only on the economics, especially after such a political speech by Julie, which and I share a lot of things is what have been said. But first of all, thank you very much for offering me the opportunity to speak in such a prestigious place, even in digital form, with a very esteemed panelists. It's an honor and a pleasure for me. Maybe one point of the disclaimer before I start. If I'm reliant on German digital infrastructure to be with you today, so if there is an issue with my internet connection, apologize for that. So now, there is no doubt that the involvement of the states in the European economies will remain stronger after COVID than they were before, and this in many respects. We will see more public investment with the European Recovery Fund and possibly an overhaul of the European fiscal rules. We will see probably more state participation, possibly as a way out to repay or not repay for the loan guarantees provided to the corporates, European corporates during COVID, and also to fill the gap in European equity, which is a problem. We will probably also see more or more permanent income support to households or companies. Think about, for instance, what Spain decided on minimum income. And perhaps we will have a pinch of fiscal dominance applied to central banks, especially the ECB, in order to finance this renaissance of the European states and more debt. But in this context, and before discussing the economic dimension of what's going on, I would bring up two issues, two questions in terms of introductory remarks. Perhaps the first question is why we are moving towards more state intervention in Europe. Is the current public health crisis the reason? I'm not sure. I believe that COVID served as a catalyst to more state intervention in the EU economy, but this is not the main cause. Some subtle political changes in Brussels, Paris, and Berlin predate COVID. I think in particular about the conversion of Berlin, at least of the German economic ministry, to the merits of a pan-European industrial policy, so some kind of pan-European Colbertism, and the critics also addressed to the EU competition policy hindering strategic mergers inside Europe. The COVID crisis also offered the European Green Deal, Ursula von der Leyen's political agenda, a 750 billion funding scheme that will revive public investment and elegantly allow to bypass the Maastricht criteria. I think that the underlying reason of the conversion of Europe to more state interventionism posted mixed results in the past. So Europe has lost the technological battle to the US and to China, and Europe needed a wake-up call to avoid losing the geopolitical battle. So we should not forget the historical dimension of our present. We are living this, what Karl Polanyi described as double movement of hyper-globalization spread in global markets that raise the need to more regulation, more guidance, more protection at the local level, the state. I would not speak about isolation, but the hyper-globalization is perhaps a common factor behind Brexit and the current transformation we are seeing or we are talking about in terms of European political economy. My second point, another question might be what kind of state interventionism we will see in Europe. Are we talking about, and this is something that Julie touched upon, but are we talking about more interventionism at the level of the member states, at the level of the European institutions, or at both levels in a coordinated way? The European Recovery Fund seems to open the way to much more coordination. I remember that less than 2 decades ago, political scientists were describing the European Union by means of the famous principal agent model. Democratic elected member states were the principal that delegated some unpleasant tasks to the EU as an agent. With the Green Deal, the conditionality linked to the European recovery grants, I would argue that this dual role is vanishing. The European Union has become much more than a delegate agent of the member states in the past few months. This raises, of course, the question of the democratic accountability of European institutions, another debate I would not open now, but it probably paves the way to further integration, a new treaty, and a new kind of political economy. The simple fact that 27 sovereign states decided to borrow money together over 30 years without explicit fiscal federalism strengthen my view that the European integration is a sui generis process that goes much beyond the framework of economic theory, and you can no more analyze the European Union and the European Monetary Union by means of optimal currency areas or something like that. But let me stop there to leave the room for the discussion.
Thank you very much. So it's fascinating and some really interesting points to follow up on. I think one of the things that I was wondering, and before I go into that, I should remind everyone again to please put any and all questions into the Q&A box so we can really get the discussion going. And yes, let us know whether you want to ask them live as well. But yeah, to come back to one of the points that I thought was really interesting was, Silvana, the point that you made about really a lot of this shift, and particularly this shift in certain ways from the market to the state, so to say, predating COVID, and then particularly looking at, for instance, competition policy. That really reminds me of the case last year now, when France and Germany were hoping to push for a merger for Siemens and Alstom, the train manufacturers. However, this did run up into the European Commission, which said, well, that doesn't comply with the European competition rules, and they basically torpedoed that. That was then led to the response from France and Germany, but that hasn't really gone anywhere yet. And I think that was one of the things that really prompted us to think about this a bit when we, in the Europe program, we wrote our paper, in that a lot of the EU structures and rules that we have at the moment are really, in a certain way, about constraining the power of the state to intervene in the markets, which led us to the question, is such a shift in the perception of the right balance between the state and the market, is it actually compatible with the current EU as we have? And you mentioned, well, we might be working towards a new treaty, but of course, every time that comes up, there will be someone in the room who says, well, it's going to be impossible to agree to a new treaty, given all the different splits that we have within the EU. So I was really curious to hear from both of you what you think in terms of, is such a shift, is that compatible with the kind of EU that we have now, and the kind of rules and EU laws that we have now, and the kind of treaties really that the EU is built on at the moment? So I'll let, sorry, Silvana, I'll let you go first.
Oh, Julie, if you want to start. No? Okay. No, this is exactly what's happening. So right now, this kind of discussion of semantic shift of inside Europe. Maybe the Brexit is also a reason for this shift inside, or the shift in debate inside Europe. But the European competition policy corresponds or coincides, I would say, with the German doctrine of ordoliberalism. You need to protect the market participants from the state power by ensuring full competition or optimal competition. And this optimal competition is seen through the lens of the market structure, the size of the market participants. It's a neoclassical view on the competition, on the market structure, which is a bit old-fashioned if you read some famous economists, for instance, like Hayek. But it's still it was still the institution we had in Europe, and with the rise of China, which is not coping with an ordoliberal view on competition policy, there has been some, discussion in Europe still going on, but also in Germany, in Berlin, asking whether this ordoliberal view of ordoliberal organization of the competition policy is still optimal, because the risk is for Europe not only to risk to lose the technological battle, but to lose the battle at all in an increasingly bipolar world. So maybe, and remember also, once again, I think we should really consider the historical dimension of what we are living. Think about the French way of thinking about industrial policy opposed to the neoliberal, ordoliberal competition policy. The Colbertism, the French classic Colbertism, which aimed at raising national champions, raising the potential of the industrial potential of an economy, was a doctrine of a time where the French crown was trying to dominate the rest of Europe. So maybe the ordoliberal, and even Walter Eucken wrote that, the grandfather of the German ordoliberalism, but each theory is the child of his historic development. And ordoliberalism was probably the right answer after the Second World War in order to keep the state power distant from the markets, but the rise of China is a game changer in terms of economic policy for Europe.
That's interesting. So it's more China than actually COVID that you think has been the driver.
You always need a crisis to catalyze some transformation. And the COVID is probably, Brexit is one of them, the COVID is one of them. And as Julie mentioned, also the past crisis that the Eurozone and the EU experienced in 2012 and 2015 are other catalysts of the current transformation you see.
Julie, do you think that the political winds within the EU are favorable to this, or because as I said, this would probably require a treaty change at some point, which we all know. There's a reason why that hasn't been tried for over a decade now.
So one of the impediments to treaty change has left the European Union. And of course, that was one of the reasons David Cameron was so opposed to having the Fiscal Compact Treaty as an EU treaty, was because he didn't want to have the referendum to ratify it, which we would have had to do under the EU Act 2011. So the absence of the United Kingdom, in some ways, makes treaty change more possible. But we have got, and we've talked a lot about France and Germany, we haven't really talked about Central and Eastern Europe. And one of the things that's noticeable in terms of solidarity, the ECFR's solidarity tracker has various activities that Hungary's done. But actually they're things like opening the borders to Bulgarians coming home, sort of essentially trying to get out of quarantine or whatever. They're not necessarily longer term changes. And I think we are likely to see some real tensions between some of the Central and East European countries on the one hand and the and France and Germany on the other. So at the moment, you've got some countries that really would be supportive of deeper integration. The way around it might be to do what was done with the Fiscal Compact, which would be to have an international treaty. It's not ideal, but it's the way around it, because you don't necessarily have to have all the member states, and the ratification process can be easier. So it's not something that if I were advising either the governments in France or Germany, or I were chef de cabinet to von der Leyen or any of the commissioners, but it might be a way around.
Okay, so more the Euro crisis strategy again.
Might have to be.
Yes. And we'll move on to the question from the audience. Again, please everyone just throw your questions into the Q&A box. We have a first question from David Henry Doyle, and I think someone will open up the microphone for you if you want to ask that question to the panelists.
Sure, yeah, thank you very much. Hi Sylvain, hi Julie. I know both of you from a previous life as a student of Julie and as a colleague of Sylvain, so great to see you together on this platform. My question was really about the plans to internationalize the euro, this is something that the European Commission has trotted out a number of times over the last year and a half, and really stems from, I think, the failure of the Iran nuclear deal and the dominance of the dollar in international commodity and capital markets. So my real question was, do you think it's sort of a realistic tool to give the EU more clout and autonomy in the international geopolitical order, to sort of use the euro as a weapon? Or is this sort of more sort of imaginative, creative narrative from the EU that they don't have a lot of hard tools in geopolitical terms? So let's talk up the euro while the dollar is sort of, you know, perhaps reaching a hiatus as an instrument of global policy. So I was very curious, you know, what you think of this proposal, and if you believe that other geopolitical tools might be more suitable.
I noticed you don't mention sterling at all. It's the dollar or the euro. And I think, again, there's a way in which the euro has gained strength in recent months. And there is clearly an opportunity for the euro to play an important role. The question, though, is how far the European Union can really set a policy. Is it going to be setting parameters for the ECB? How far is that actually going to give any leverage? I'm not wholly sure. I think there are other ways in which the European Union could do more, which would be a lot more about speaking with one voice on international issues. And yes, the Iran deal has hit a wall, but it hasn't hit a wall because of European failures. It's hit a wall because the United States decided it wasn't fit for purpose. And I think one of the things that the EU 27 needs to think about, perhaps with the United Kingdom as a close neighbour, is how far it needs to develop its own international policy that will be crucial if the United States is going to be led, perhaps for another 4 years, by Donald Trump, whose interests and approach are really very different from those of Europe, and whose values are quite different from the values that underpin the European project.
You touch upon a very great point, David. So on the internationalization of the euro is another political shift we have had in the European Union, which predates COVID. It's related probably partly to the behavior of the US administration we have had. And remember, we have one letter sent by the European Commission President in December 2018, making the internationalization of the euro an objective, a political objective of the European Union. And this was at that time something completely new. Maybe people are seeing the European Recovery Fund as a game changer, but a letter of the President of the European Commission saying, I want to international the euro, was already a political shift. Remember that the Bundesbank always, never wanted to internationalize the role of the Deutschmark. Because of what it means. And what does it mean to internationalize a currency? It's the privilege of the dollar. You need to run large current account deficits. And it's much easier for the US to do that than for the Eurozone, especially with Germany being the exporter #1 worldwide. So this is a shift, and in some point, the European economy is already enjoying the privilege of having an international currency. And I come back on that. But on the other side, it will be almost impossible in the foreseeable future to challenge the role of the dollar independently of the results of the US elections. This is because of the financing channels and system we have in Europe. If you look at the euro makes something a bit more than 20% of the world's FX reserves. But in terms of debt issuance, it's still very small. The only point where the euro is winning a bit more in terms of international role is the international lending. And this is due to the fact that interest rates in the Eurozone are so low that the euro has become a carry trade currency like the yen in the 90s. So this is not exactly what I would say a success in terms of internationalization of the euro. Having said that, what you see is that many European corporates have discovered the benefits of the euro as an international currency with very low interest rates to do exactly what US companies did in the 80s, namely to invest massively abroad by lending at home at very low interest rates and investing abroad in the US, in Asia, in Europe outside the Eurozone. And this is exactly the strategy described by Hélène Rey as a venture capitalist. The euro made more risky investment abroad possible, meaning it's making the financing, the external financing of the European economies easier than before. So no big development in terms of internationalization, and I think it will keep like that, but still the European economy is benefiting from the euro a lot.
That's really interesting, and I've a follow-up question to that, in particularly around the point of what it requires to have an international reserve currency, basically, which is you also need to be issuing basically debt for everyone to keep their reserves in, and it's something that the US clearly is willing to do, but that historically, particularly the largest Eurozone economy, is very much unwilling to do, and that has actually been doing the opposite in recent years, and through its surpluses, been removing debt from the market. Especially in the last couple of months, of course, we've seen quite a shift in that, of course, necessitated by the current crisis. Germany let go of its Schwarze Null, its black zero policy of balanced budgets. The European Commission won't be enforcing the fiscal compact and won't be enforcing the fiscal rules within the Eurozone. So basically every country is going to be running deficits of around 10% of GDP. So I'm very curious to hear whether you think that is a more permanent shift in terms of fiscal policy, not just around the kind of deficits to run, but also how fiscal policy gets used, not just on the European level where we have the recovery fund, but also on the national level. So will we see this becoming slightly more permanent, or do you, and I guess this goes for both of you, do you expect particularly a country like Germany to basically revert to form in 2 years' time and start aiming for surpluses again? So I'll throw that over to Julie first.
Well, I think one of the issues is precisely at the moment, interest rates are so low that having deficits isn't necessarily as catastrophic as at times when you're going to have much higher interest rates. And so there is a question of, what's the cost of money and what's the cost of borrowing? But ultimately, it's going to depend on the political situation as much as the economic, I think, that whether these are permanent changes or temporary will to a large extent depend on what the electors are saying in the next elections in each of the member states. And it's not going to be overturned by elections to the European Parliament, it's going to be elections in the member states. And if Sylvain is right, and I think he is, that some of these changes have begun to come about before the COVID crisis, which has maybe acted as a catalyst, then maybe we are seeing some shift away from a neoliberal order to something that's more social democratic, where the role of the state is more important. And if that is the case, then that is potentially the time when we could also be looking for the sort of economic levers at a European level that you really need if the Eurozone is going to be stable. because at the moment we still don't have those automatic fiscal stabilizers or the political union that you need in order to make the Eurozone internally coherent. And maybe this is the time for that change.
Yeah, let me put it that way. A good family father does not only repay its debt for his children, he invests in the family capital. And that's what the European, continental Europe, did too less in the past. The British taxpayers are happy citizens in terms of public investment, fueled from the continent. I've seen many reportages on the British TV channel with people complaining about too few public investments in the UK. Hey, come on the continent, that's worse. There is a 1 percentage point gap of net public investment between the UK and big Eurozone countries for now almost a decade. That means that the continental European states are not investing enough in the future generations. And what's the problem? What's the difference to the UK? This is budget rules. In the UK, you have the so-called golden rules for public investment that take the public investment outside accounting for debt consolidation and budget consolidation. And this is a point that has been acknowledged by the European Fiscal Board, which published a report last year, also predating COVID, on the efficiency of the European budget rules. And this report said, was very clear, saying, well, the Maastricht criteria are not very efficient. You cannot maintain 3 percentage point total deficit in order to keep the public debt ratio stable at 60% in a world in which you have almost zero inflation and much less potential growth than at time of Maastricht. That's simply just debt accounting. Look at the situation in Germany, look at the situation in Italy, in Spain, but France is also becoming much of the same. Public investment is net term, so once you take account of the depreciation of public infrastructures, has been zero or even negative. You do not invest in the next generations. So, and this overall of the European budget rules would have been discussed by the summer if we did not have the COVID crisis. Now, by chance, we have, or by chance, I don't know, I will not say that, but the recession is so deep that the European fiscal rules have been suspended. Leaving time for the European Commission and Parliament to think about how to overhaul the budget rules to make them intelligent, to allow, like the British government can do, to allow the European states to invest more, what is the only way to raise potential GDP if you spend the money in a smart way. So yes, this is also in the pipeline. So an overall of the European budget rule is in the pipeline. Politically speaking, you cannot cancel Maastricht, because this is one of the very few points of the European integration for which you asked European citizens to vote. So the democratic accountability of Maastricht is bigger than the report of the fiscal board. That's clear. But yeah, you need to bring to allow more public investment on the continent, and the European Next Gen plan is a way to do that, bypassing the budget rules, but it's not enough. You need to address the question of the budget rules.
Yes, yeah. As a Dutchman, I'm very aware of the political power of the Maastricht criteria and how difficult it would be to get at least my government to agree to let them go. I think one really interesting thing that you mentioned, Julie, was that a lot of this is about effectively what happens sort of on an electoral level in Europe, and whether you'll see the kind of shifts there that would actually open up the political space to do this. And we actually had a question in that direction from Samuel Wilkin. So just open it up to him to ask that question, and if he could also just tell us your affiliation quickly as well. Okay, and yes. It's
David Simmons. I'm retired and just recently joined Chatham House as an associate member. So it's my first webinar. So thank you for having me. Let me give a question, and thanks for the two talks. My question was, will the COVID response facilitate or delay the EU's objectives for decarbonisation to meet its climate change goals?
I would like to come in, Julie, would you like to say something about that?
I think potentially the European Union could take this as the opportunity to say, yeah, we're going to invest. It's important to invest for the future. Exactly as Sylvain is saying, we need to think about future generations. But the way to do that is through green investment rather than further investment in dirty coal. And I think if the agenda is being set by von der Leyen, for example, then we're going to see something which is greener and more forward-looking than perhaps if we had a Polish president of the Commission who might be saying, well, actually my country's got a different perspective. So I think it is an opportunity, or could be an opportunity.
Same answer from my side. I think the COVID will facilitate the decarbonization of the European economy in the way that the EU Green Deal as we say, receive massive funding from the member states, agreed even from the north of Europe. And this will it will have been much more difficult for Ursula von der Leyen to convince the 27 states to finance the investments we need to implement the Green Deal and to make it happen. So from the financing point of view, yes, the COVID is a facilitator of the green and digital transition. From the investment point of view, I don't know. I mean, is it technically feasible to decarbonize the European economy at the pace that has been set by Ursula von der Leyen? I'm just an economist. I don't know. But at least, yes, it's a facilitator.
Thank you, David, for that question. Welcome to Chatham House. And we'll move on to Sammy Wilkin for his question.
Okay, thank you. And I liked David's question as well. The question I wanted to ask was about populism. Everyone traditionally, I'm from Willis Towers Watson, I think I said. The question I wanted to ask about populism, everyone traditionally worries about Italy, unless we should be worried about someone else. And about authoritarianism within the EU, I think everyone traditionally worries about Hungary and Poland, although it would be interesting to hear if we should be worried about anyone else.
So you want to start?
You want to start on that?
Yeah, who should we be worried about?
Okay, it's difficult to say, but what I think is that with grants, 390 billion of grants. If you look at the whole package the European Union is offering to the member states, made of grants and loans, something like 30% will go to Italy, a bit more than a quarter will go to Spain, 10% will go to Poland from the support, from the EU support. The net benefits are something different. And for the first time in the history of the EU will try to intensify the member states to fulfill its political goals, the Green Deal, the digital transition, with a carrot, grants. and not with a button, the Maastricht criteria. It's a huge difference that at some point, if the European Recovery Plan succeeds in terms of public investment, increasing GDP per capita, and so on, then at some point you should see voters a bit more happy to have or to live within the European Union. But that's the rational, or that's a rational argumentation that an economist can have. Politics is something different. I leave it to Julie.
I'm going to start with something which might, in a Chatham House context, sound a little bit surprising, and even more surprising from somebody whose political affiliation is as a Liberal Democrat in the United Kingdom. But I notice the language we're tending to use is, who should we be worried about? Should we be worried about the populists? Should we be worried about the authoritarians? And I think one of the things that it's really important to think about is what messages, what signals do politicians give out to voters? And do voters feel they're being listened to? And I was picked up in a seminar a few years ago by an academic because I clearly expressed my personal views, my concern about anti-immigration parties. And I was basically put back in my box and told that actually it was a very elitist opinion that I had just articulated, because if people wanted to vote for anti-immigration parties in a democracy, that was their choice. And I think one of the things that we need to think about is what messages are being sent by politicians, and how far do politicians actually seem to be willing and able to deliver what citizens need. And I think the rational economic response that Sylvain has given is absolutely right, that if there are clearly economic benefits coming from membership of the European Union, then I think it's much easier to say to voters, well, look, this money's coming, we're benefiting, there are tangible benefits. And if you can see tangible benefits, you can persuade people who might be minded to vote for a Eurosceptic or a populist party. But the more that we have the sticks, the more that we have the conditionality and the sense of, are we going to sanction countries for the way they behave? The danger then is that you create some sort of martyr, so that Viktor Orban will say, well, look how they're treating me. Hungary is a proud country and we're being treated badly. And then that creates even more support for him rather than less. And so that balance of sticks and carrots, of being able to persuade the member states and their voters of the liberal, democratic, human rights values that have been enshrined by the European Union, is quite a difficult balancing act. Some of it's about the economic outcomes, but some of it also needs to be about persuasion.
I think that we still have 3 minutes. I'm just going to ask one very quick final question, because looking back over the sort of the last 6-7 months and the way that the political winds have changed in that time, we sort of initially saw a bit of a rally around the flag effect, at least in the political polls, where whoever was in charge, whoever was in government, saw a large boost in support, and in a lot of countries the populist parties did quite badly, suggesting that any sort of competent management, for instance, of both the economy and really the health aspect really boosted, let's say, the mainstream parties. So I'm quite curious whether, and this also harps back, I think, to the main topic that we've been discussing in terms of shifts in political economy, balance between the state and the market, whether actually after what will have been at least a year of the government or the state controlling the economy through lockdowns, but also controlling people's social lives, their work lives, in a very negative context, even though this has had very positive benefits in terms of health and economic outcomes, that we might actually get a swing the other way, that actually we might see a massive boost for the populace, particularly in a context where if we're relying on the European Recovery Fund, the money for that doesn't start flowing until early next year. Before we see any sort of impact of that, we will be a few years down the line. So I'm quite curious to hear what you think about, actually, this might be good for the populace, even if at the moment they seem to be struggling a bit.
Shall I come in? I mean, I think the one word I would use is competence, that if the incumbent governments appear to get a balance of good health outcomes without completely trashing the economies, where if deficit spending is leading to investment, is supporting jobs, then maybe the mainstream parties can persist and thrive. But the more incompetent a government is, then I think the more the challenges are going to come, possibly from the extremes, but it depends on who is the incumbent government.
One explicit variable that explains populist votes across Europe is negatively correlated to confidence and unemployment. The unemployment rate is probably at least for my country, this is the case. Unemployment rate is the main reason for populist votes. And now that in this crisis, so almost all European states jumped on these furlough schemes to avoid massive increase in unemployment rate. And my guess is that in most countries, these furlough schemes will be extended to the point that the economy can be left on standalone basis. You will probably have noticed that the German government decided to extend the short-term working schemes to after the general elections. I leave it there.
Yes, that's a slightly worrying thought for us in the UK, given that the government here is talking about winding it down by October. But I'll leave everyone to draw their own conclusions from that. Thank you, Julie and Sylvain, for a really interesting discussion. Thank you, everyone, for joining us and for asking some great questions. I think this was part of a series which the corporate team put on for us, I think every 2 weeks. So there'll be another one soon. And that just leaves me to wish you all a very good evening.